The coffee in the orbital station tasted like recycled regret, which was fitting since that's essentially what it was. Elena Vross held the cup between her palms and stared through the observation deck's transparisteel at Cathara Prime rotating below, all swirling amber clouds and glimpses of silver cities that looked like they'd been grown rather than built. 43 hours until she descended to the surface. 43 hours to second-guess every decision that had brought her to this moment. "You look like you're planning your own funeral," said Commander Torres, settling into the seat across from her with his own cup of dubious liquid. He was the station chief, a career military man with laugh lines that suggested he'd learned not to take the universe too seriously. That's generally a bad sign in a diplomat. Elena managed a weak smile. "Just wondering if they chose me because I'm qualified or because I'm expendable." "Both, probably." Torres took a sip and grimaced. "God, this stuff gets worse every cycle. You know the recyclers are working at 93% efficiency. I try not to think about what happened to the other 7%. He paused, studying her face. "The committee chose you because you don't lie well. Strange qualification for a diplomat, I know, but the Ketherans have some kind of biological detection for dishonesty. Pheromones or microexpressions or something the xenobiologists are still arguing about. Point is, they know when they're being played. That's supposed to make me feel better. Is it working?" "Not remotely." Torres laughed, a sound that seemed too warm for the sterile environment of the station. "Look, I've been coordinating traffic in this sector for 6 years. The Catharans aren't monsters, they're just particular. They built this station with 16 other species, let us use their orbital space, agreed to quarterly supply runs. That's not nothing. They also refused face-to-face contact for 40 years and think human features are disturbing." Elena had memorized the briefing materials, couldn't stop picking at them like a scab. "There's a whole section about their aesthetic philosophy that basically translates to humans are cosmic horror. To be fair, have you seen humans?" Torres gestured at his own face. "We're basically ambulatory water balloons with anxiety. The Catharans are isolationists, sure, but they're also desperately curious. Why else would they finally agree to this? You're the first human they've invited planetside in 3 generations." The weight of that statement settled over Elena like a lead blanket. First contact scenarios ran through her head, all the ways this could go catastrophically wrong. Humanity had been exploring the stars for 3 centuries now, had encountered 47 distinct spacefaring civilizations, and had managed to accidentally insult or terrify 32 of them. The Catharans controlled 12 worlds and had quantum displacement technology that made Earth's fastest ships look like paper airplanes. If she failed here, it wouldn't just be embarrassing. It could lock humanity out of an entire sector of space. "You're spiraling," Torres observed. "I can actually see the panic working its way across your face. It's fascinating from a clinical perspective. I'm so glad my anxiety entertains you. Someone's got to find joy in the small things." He leaned forward, his expression softening slightly. "Elena, listen. The selection committee reviewed 3,000 candidates. They chose you because when you were interviewed, you were asked what you'd do if you encountered a species whose values contradicted everything you believed in. You want to know what you said?" Elena shook her head. The interview was a blur of stress and carefully rehearsed answers. "You said, I'd probably make a mistake, apologize sincerely, and hope they appreciated the honesty. Not exactly textbook diplomacy, but it's real, and real is what the Ketharans seem to want." He stood, draining the last of his coffee with a theatrical shudder. "Get some rest. The shuttle leaves at 0600, and you'll want to be sharp when you see the capital. It's supposed to be something else." Something else turned out to be a dramatic understatement. The descent through Cathara Prime's atmosphere was smooth. The Ketharans had gravitational damping technology that made turbulence obsolete, but Elena barely noticed. She was pressed against the viewport, watching the cloud layer break apart to reveal the impossible geometry of Velshara, the planetary capital. The city spiraled out from a central tower that pierced the lower atmosphere, its architecture all flowing curves and crystalline spires that seemed to shift color in the light of the twin suns. Nothing met at right angles. Everything flowed like frozen music. The pilot, a taciturn woman named Hayes who'd been running the Cathara route for 2 years, noticed Alina's expression and almost smiled. "Yeah, I had the same reaction my first time. Wait until you see it at night when the bioluminescent grid activates. It's like the whole city dreams in color." "How do they build like that?" Alina couldn't look away. The structural engineering alone should be impossible. "They grow it. Most of the buildings are a silicon-based organism they've been cultivating for about 6,000 years. The whole city is technically alive, just in a way that doesn't move much and doesn't mind being inhabited." Hayes adjusted their approach vector. "Fair warning, the welcoming committee is going to be masked. Try not to take it personally. I've read the briefings. Reading and experiencing are different animals. Just remember they're probably more nervous than you are." Alina doubted that was possible but appreciated the sentiment. The shuttle settled onto a landing platform that extended from one of the spiral towers, and she forced herself to breathe slowly, evenly, like her meditation instructor had taught her. It didn't help. When the airlock cycled open and she stepped onto Catharan soil for the first time, gravity slightly lighter than Earth standard making her steps feel bouncy and uncertain, she was met by 5 figures in elaborate masks that covered everything from the neck up. The masks were beautiful in an unsettling way, all smooth curves and iridescent surfaces that reflected the sunlight in shifting patterns, but they were also completely opaque. Alina couldn't see eyes or any hint of the faces beneath. The central figure stepped forward, and when they spoke, it was through a translator device that rendered their words in flat, emotionless English. "Dr. Alina Vross, we welcome you to Cathara Prime. I am Administrator Shalvin, Coordinator of Interspecies Relations. Your quarters have been prepared in the diplomatic compound. We trust they will be acceptable." Alina bowed slightly, the gesture of respect she'd practiced. "Thank you, Administrator. I'm honored to be here and grateful for your hospitality." There was a pause just a beat too long, and she wondered if she'd already made some invisible error. Then Shalvin inclined their head. "Your sincerity is noted. Please follow us. The compound is nearby, and we believe you will find the accommodations suitable." Suitable turned out to mean luxurious in ways that made Alina uncomfortable. Her quarters occupied the upper floors of a smaller tower, with windows that offered panoramic views of the city and rooms that seemed to anticipate her needs before she recognized them herself. The furniture adjusted to her body shape. The lighting shifted with her circadian rhythms. The bathroom had a shower that used some kind of sonic technology she didn't understand, but that left her feeling more clean than water ever had. It was thoughtful and generous and felt absolutely like quarantine. The garden existed in defiance of probability, which made it Alina's favorite place on Cathara Prime by the end of her 3rd week. She discovered it by accident during one of her increasingly desperate walks around the diplomatic compound, following a maintenance corridor that should have led to another sterile conference room, but instead opened onto 3 acres of controlled chaos, where Earth vegetables grew alongside alien flora that pulsed with bioluminescence even in daylight. The tomatoes were what caught her attention first. Actual, impossible, gloriously normal tomatoes climbing up trellises next to vines that produced fruit resembling liquid mercury contained in transparent skin. Someone had planted basil. Someone had planted what looked like carrots. And someone, bless their optimistic heart, had attempted to grow corn in soil that was probably worth more than Alina's annual salary, given that it had been transported across light years of space. She knelt beside the tomato plants, breathing in the green smell of the leaves, and felt something unknot in her chest. The diplomatic sessions had been polite torture, Hours of circular conversations with masked officials who spoke through translators, discussing trade frameworks and cultural exchange programs while carefully avoiding anything remotely personal. She'd begun to suspect that humanity's gift for small talk was unique in the galaxy, that every other species had evolved past the need for weather-based pleasantries and had never looked back. "The red ones are ready, I think," said a voice behind her in English so perfect it took Alina a moment to register that it couldn't be human. "Though I'm never entirely certain. Your agricultural texts are very confident about ripeness indicators, but the actual fruit never seems to have read the same materials." Alina turned, still crouching, and found herself looking up at a Ketharan woman without a mask. The shock of it froze her for a heartbeat. The woman was tall, with the kind of posture that suggested either military training or royal breeding, wearing simple clothes in deep blue that looked practical rather than ceremonial. Her face was striking in ways Alina's brain struggled to process, features that suggested both familiarity and profound difference, with high cheekbones and a jawline that could cut glass. But it was the ears that drew Alina's attention, long and elegantly tapered, catching the light from the twin suns in a way that made them seem almost luminous. "I'm sorry," the woman said quickly, and something that might have been embarrassment crossed her features. "I should have announced myself, and I should be wearing my mask. The protocol officers would be horrified." She didn't move to leave, though, and Alina realized she was curious, watching to see how the human would react. Alina stood, brushing dirt from her knees, and made a decision that would probably feature prominently in her performance review. "Please don't apologize. I've been having conversations with masks for 3 weeks, and I was starting to suspect that Ketharans might just be very sophisticated puppets operated by committees." She paused. "That was a joke, possibly not a good one. I should mention I'm not great at humor under pressure." The woman's expression shifted into something that might have been amusement. "The puppet theory would explain a great deal about our bureaucracy." She moved closer, studying Alina with unconcealed interest. "You're the human diplomat, Dr. Vross. I've read your papers on cross-cultural communication theory. Your argument about the tyranny of assumed context was quite compelling, though your colleague's rebuttal in the Journal of Xenosociology made some valid points about the impossibility of truly neutral observation." Alina blinked. "You've read the academic journals." "Voraciously. We have 40 years of human transmissions to catch up on, and I've made it something of a personal project." The woman gestured at the garden around them. "This was my idea, actually. The agricultural exchange program. I thought if we could make earth plants grow in Ketharan soil and vice versa, it might suggest that other kinds of compatibility were possible. An optimistic metaphor, perhaps, but I've always been prone to those." "It's working," Alina said, looking at the thriving tomatoes. "Better than the diplomatic talks, honestly." "Yes, well, diplomacy is difficult when both sides are terrified of giving offense." The woman touched one of the tomato leaves gently. "Your people think we're cold and isolationist. My people think you're chaotic and aggressive. Everyone's so busy trying not to confirm the other's worst assumptions that we've all forgotten how to have an actual conversation." There was something refreshing about the directness, and Alina felt herself relaxing despite the strangeness of the situation. "I'm Alina, by the way. I know you probably know that, but it feels weird not to introduce myself." "Lyri." The woman offered a hand in a gesture that was clearly learned from human customs, and Alina shook it, noting the difference in temperature. Ketharan baseline was a few degrees warmer than human. "And before you ask, yes, I'm supposed to be somewhere else doing something official. But the garden is more honest than most meetings, so I consider this time well spent." They fell into conversation, the way Alina imagined people used to fall into wells, accidentally, and with gathering momentum. Lyri knew an absurd amount about Earth culture, could quote human philosophers, and debate the merits of different agricultural techniques, but her knowledge had the peculiar quality of being entirely theoretical. She'd never tasted coffee, never felt rain, never experienced any of the small, mundane things that made human life human. "Your entertainment programs are fascinating," Lyrie said at one point, examining a pepper plant with the concentration of a surgeon. "Though I admit I find your horror genre confusing. You intentionally frighten yourselves for recreation, and pay for the privilege." Alina laughed. "It's complicated, something about controlled fear being cathartic. Plus, the monsters are usually metaphors for social anxieties or existential dread." "The monsters," Larry repeated, and something in her tone made Alina look up sharply. "The aliens, you mean? The things with too many limbs or wrong faces or—" She stopped, her expression carefully neutral in a way that suggested significant emotion underneath. "Lyrie, it's fine, I know how we must appear to you, how I appear." Lyrie straightened and her voice took on a formal quality. "The masks aren't just about our comfort, you understand. We've seen your media. We know what you consider beautiful and we know what you cast as monsters, the ears especially. Apparently, they're a common feature of your fictional threatening species." Alina felt something twist in her chest. Some human artists have limited imagination and unfortunate biases. "But that's not— I don't," she struggled for words, aware that this was precisely the kind of moment diplomats were supposed to be trained for, and that her training was failing spectacularly. "You're not remotely monstrous. You're being kind." "I'm being honest, which is different and generally more awkward." Alina surprised herself by stepping closer. "Lyrie, I've spent 3 weeks talking to masks, and it's been like trying to have a conversation with elegant furniture. You're the first person I've actually spoken with since I arrived. That matters more than you apparently think it does." Lyrie's expression was unreadable for a long moment, and Alina wondered if she'd somehow made things catastrophically worse. Then Lyrie smiled just slightly and said, "The coffee plants are over here if you'd like to see them. They're not producing beans yet, but I'm told I'm supposed to be patient about these things." Patience has never been my strongest quality. The garden meetings became a routine that Alina looked forward to with an intensity that probably violated several diplomatic protocols. Every morning at dawn, when the twin suns painted the sky in shades of rose and copper, she'd find Lyrie already there, examining some plant or another with the focused attention of someone who found peace in growing things. They'd talk for an hour, sometimes 2, about everything except politics. Lyrie had opinions about human music that were both insightful and completely wrong. Alina had theories about Ketharan architecture that made Lyrie laugh until she had to sit down on one of the stone benches scattered throughout the garden. "You think we build in spirals because of mathematical elegance," Lyrie said one morning, wiping tears from her eyes. "Alina, we build in spirals because our most influential architect 3,000 years ago was famously drunk when he designed the first capital, and everyone was too polite to mention it. By the time he sobered up, the style had become traditional." Alina stared at her. "You're joking." "I'm completely serious. There's a statue of him in the city center. He's holding a bottle of fermented Koval juice and looking very pleased with himself. We're not as dignified as your briefing materials suggest. This changes everything I thought I knew about your civilization." "Good, you were thinking of us as inscrutable wise aliens. We're actually just people who happen to develop quantum displacement before we develop decent hangovers cures." Lyrie plucked a ripe tomato from the vine and bit into it like an apple, juice running down her chin. "Your vegetables are better than ours, by the way. Ours are nutritionally optimized but taste like virtuous disappointment." Alina had learned that Lyrie was not, in fact, just another curious Ketharan but the heir apparent to the entire planetary confederation. This information had been delivered casually during a discussion about soil pH levels, as if mentioning one's future responsibility for 12 worlds was equivalent to commenting on the weather. When Alina had nearly choked on her water, Lyrie had looked genuinely confused. Did your briefing materials not mention that? I assumed you knew. They mentioned a Princess Lyrie in the line of succession. They didn't mention she spent her mornings discussing drunk architects with random diplomats. You're not random. You're the first human I've spoken to without a political agenda attached. Lyrie had paused. Well, without an obvious political agenda, I assume you have some. Everyone does. My agenda is to not cause an interstellar incident and maybe figure out why your people think human faces are disturbing. That. Lyrie had looked away, suddenly interested in the pepper plants. It's complicated. Complicated turned out to be an understatement. Over the next week, through carefully oblique conversations, Alina pieced together that Ketharan aesthetic philosophy was tied to evolutionary psychology in ways that made perfect sense and no sense simultaneously. Humans had evolved as social predators, which apparently resulted in forward-facing eyes that Ketharans found intensely unsettling. The flatness of human faces, the exposure of the eyes without protective ridges, the way human expressions involved the entire face rather than being concentrated in specific features. All of it triggered some deep instinct that registered as threat. It's not personal, Lyrie explained one morning while they were attempting to coax the struggling coffee plants into greater enthusiasm about existence. If it helps, we find most other species equally disturbing. The Voreth have too many joints in their limbs. The Sessane communicate partially through color changes that make our visual cortex hurt. The Talvines smell like decomposition to us, though they're actually quite pleasant people once you get past the gagging. That's weirdly comforting. We're not uniquely horrifying, just part of a galaxy-wide pattern of mutual discomfort. Exactly. Xenophobia is the default setting for most intelligent species. Overcoming it requires active effort and usually significant economic incentive. Lyrie sat back on her heels, her long ears catching the morning light in a way that made Alina's breath catch slightly. The masks are a compromise. They let us interact without triggering those instinctive reactions. But you don't wear one with me. Lyrie was quiet for a long moment, her attention apparently focused on adjusting the irrigation settings for the coffee plants. When she finally spoke, her voice was carefully controlled. I've been educated in 17 languages, trained in quantum mechanics and political theory, taught to negotiate trade agreements that span solar systems. But I've never actually met anyone from another species face to face. The isolation is supposed to preserve cultural purity, maintain the dignity of the succession. She looked up, meeting Alina's eyes directly. It mostly just makes me feel like a museum piece, something rare and fragile that can't be touched. Alina recognized loneliness when she heard it, had felt enough of it herself during the past weeks to know its particular resonance. For what it's worth, you seem pretty solid to me, not particularly fragile. I appreciate the assessment. Lyrie smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. Though you should know that my advisors have been having collective anxiety attacks about these meetings. Apparently you could be a spy or an assassin, or worst of all, a bad influence. A bad influence. You encourage me to speak casually, to make jokes, to eat tomatoes like some kind of agricultural barbarian. Lyrie's smile turned more genuine. It's very destabilizing to the social order. I'm a diplomatic disaster. They should put it on my business cards. They fell back into easier conversation, and Alina found herself relaxing in ways she hadn't since arriving on Cathara Prime. Lyrie had a sharp intelligence that didn't need to prove itself, a humor that emerged unexpectedly, and an honesty that felt revolutionary in the context of diplomatic doublespeak. She also had an alarming tendency to work herself into spirals of anxiety about things Alina considered completely insignificant. Do you think the basil is getting enough nitrogen? Lyrie asked suddenly, studying the herb garden with the intensity of someone diffusing a bomb. The leaves look slightly pale. The basil is fine. You've checked it 3 times this morning. But if it dies, the whole agricultural exchange program could be seen as a failure. and the isolationist faction would use it as evidence that cross-species cooperation is inherently flawed. And Lyrie breathed. It's Basel, not a peace treaty. Everything is political when you're heir to 12 worlds. But Lyrie did breathe, visibly forcing herself to relax. Sorry, I'm told I catastrophize. You think? Alina said it gently, and was rewarded with a small laugh. They worked in companionable silence for a while, and Alina tried not to think about how much she'd come to value these mornings, how the rest of her day felt increasingly hollow by comparison. The official meetings were still exercises in careful futility, all masked faces and translator-flattened voices discussing frameworks and protocols, while avoiding anything resembling genuine connection. In the garden, with dirt under her fingernails and Lyrie's occasionally ridiculous commentary, Alina felt like she was actually accomplishing something, even if she couldn't define what that something was. Can I ask you something potentially offensive? Lyrie said suddenly, not looking up from the tomato plant she was examining for signs of disease that definitely didn't exist. You've already told me about the drunk architect. I think we're past the point of polite boundaries. Do you actually find me attractive, or is that something you're trained to say? Diplomatically, I mean. The question hung in the air between them like a quantum particle waiting to collapse into a definite state. Alina's first instinct was to deflect with humor, to make some joke about diplomatic training not covering aesthetic assessments of alien royalty. But Lyrie was looking at her with an expression of such careful vulnerability that anything less than honesty felt like betrayal. I'm not trained to lie convincingly, Alina said finally, setting down the watering can she'd been holding. It's actually in my file as a notable weakness. During the selection process, they asked me to maintain a poker face while watching videos of increasingly absurd scenarios. I lasted 30 seconds before laughing at footage of a zero-gravity cat. That's not an answer. I'm getting there. I'm just establishing that if I tell you something, it's because I mean it, not because I've been programmed to facilitate diplomatic relations through strategic compliments. Alina wiped her hands on her pants, buying herself a moment. You're the most striking person I've ever met, the ears especially. They catch light in ways that make me forget what I was saying, which has happened at least 6 times during our conversations and is professionally embarrassing. Lyrie's expression cycled through disbelief, confusion, and something that might have been hope before settling into skepticism. You're aware that striking can mean disturbing, yes, in the sense of being notable for unsettling qualities. I'm aware that you're looking for reasons to discount what I'm saying because centuries of cultural conditioning have convinced you that humans find Ketherans monstrous. Alina surprised herself by closing the distance between them, stopping just near enough that the height difference became obvious. But I've spent 3 weeks in diplomatic sessions with masked officials, and I've spent the same 3 weeks watching the sunrise with you while you catastrophize about Basel and make jokes about drunk architects. I know which version of cross-species contact actually matters. The Basel catastrophizing. The part where we're 2 people having conversations instead of 2 species performing protocols. Alina took a breath. Lyrie, your advisors are right to be anxious. Not because you're being corrupted by bad influences, but because what we're doing here is actually radical. We're treating each other like individuals instead of representatives. That's terrifying to people whose careers depend on maintaining proper distance. Lyrie was quiet for a long moment, one hand absently touching the elongated curve of her ear in a gesture Alina had learned meant she was thinking hard about something. My mother says I'm too curious for my own good, that opening ourselves to other species will dilute what makes us Ketheran. She looked up, meeting Alina's eyes directly. But we've been isolated for so long that I'm not sure we remember what makes us Ketheran beyond the fact that we're not anything else. That's not identity. That's just fear with better architecture. Your mother being the current matriarch, ruler of the Confederation, keeper of traditions, and the person most likely to be deeply unhappy about these garden meetings once she finds out about them. Lyrie smiled, but it was edged with something that looked like resignation. She'll find out soon. She finds out everything eventually. As if summoned by the mention, a figure appeared at the garden's entrance, masked, formal, radiating the kind of authority that made Alina's diplomatic instincts scream. The figure spoke in Ketharan, the language flowing like water over stones, and Lyrie's posture shifted subtly into something more rigid. "She says my presence is required at the council session," Lyrie translated unnecessarily, since Alina's translator implant had caught the gist. "Apparently, there's been a development. The development turned out to be a crisis, though calling it that felt overly dramatic for what was essentially a bureaucratic nightmare. A mining operation on a contested border world had expanded into territory that both the Ketharan Confederation and the Human-Aligned Covenant claimed. Normally, this would be resolved through existing dispute protocols, but those protocols had been written before either side had actually tried to use them, and turned out to be mutually contradictory in ways that would have been funny if they weren't potentially catastrophic. Alina found herself in a conference room that defied comfortable spatial reasoning, all flowing curves and surfaces that seemed to exist at slight angles to each other. The human delegation had arrived via quantum communication relay, their holographic forms flickering slightly at the edges, while the Ketharan Council sat in a semicircle of masked faces that felt more like a tribunal than a negotiation. The arguments went in circles for 2 hours. The human representatives pointed to treaty language that clearly supported their interpretation. The Ketharans cited the same treaties with equal conviction to support the opposite conclusion. Alina watched the translator output scroll past, recognizing the pattern of a conversation where both sides were technically correct and therefore fundamentally deadlocked. "This is absurd," Lyrie said suddenly, her voice cutting through the diplomatic noise. She stood, and Alina noticed with a spike of alarm that she was removing her mask. The entire room seemed to freeze. "We're arguing about interpretations while ignoring the actual problem, which is that neither side trusts the other enough to believe in good faith negotiation." The human delegation's holographic representatives flickered with surprise. The Ketharan Council radiated disapproval in ways that transcended language. Lyrie ignored both, turning to address the room with her face fully visible. "Dr. Vross told me something recently that I think is relevant here. She said humans have a phrase about not being able to see the forest for the trees. We're so focused on the technical details of treaties that we've forgotten the entire purpose of those treaties was to make cooperation possible." Lyrie's ears were slightly back, a sign of nervousness Alina had learned to recognize, but her voice was steady. "I propose we stop arguing about who's right and start discussing what would actually be fair." Admiral Kowalski, leading the human delegation, looked like he'd bitten into something sour. "Your Highness, with respect, the legal framework. The legal framework was written by people who never expected it to be tested," Alina heard herself saying, surprising everyone including herself. "We can either spend months in litigation, damage both our reputations, and possibly cause a mining dispute to escalate into something nobody wants, or we can act like adults capable of finding middle ground." The silence that followed was profound and uncomfortable. Then Lyrie did something that would probably feature in diplomatic incident reports for decades. She smiled, genuinely and fully, and said, "I've been meeting with Dr. Vross every morning for 3 weeks. We've been growing tomatoes together and discussing human coffee's alarming properties. During that time, I've learned more about actual cooperation than I have in years of formal diplomatic training. Perhaps we should all try it sometime." The room erupted in reactions. The human delegation's shocked silence, the Ketharan Council's agitated murmuring, several advisors apparently having minor medical events. But in the chaos, something shifted. Someone suggested a joint oversight committee for the mining operation. Someone else proposed splitting resource extraction rights while sharing the infrastructure costs. The conversation moved from why cooperation was impossible to how it might actually work. Alina caught Lyrie's eye across the room and had to suppress the urge to laugh at the expression of terror mixed with defiance on the princess's face. They were both probably ending their careers in spectacular fashion, but at least they were doing it together. The resolution that emerged wasn't elegant or simple, but it was workable. The mining operation would proceed under joint supervision, with profits split and environmental regulations enforced by representatives from both species. It wasn't the total victory either side had wanted, which meant it was probably fair. As the delegations dispersed, and the crisis officially downgraded itself to a managed situation, Lyrie found Alina in the garden again, both of them drawn back to the only place that had felt real during the entire surreal day. "I'm probably going to be in significant trouble," Lyrie said, examining a tomato plant that had somehow thrived despite the diplomatic chaos surrounding it. "Same. Worth it, though." "You think?" "We just proved that two species who supposedly can't stand looking at each other can actually work together when they stop performing and start talking. That's not nothing." Alina paused. "Also, you quoted our tomato-growing sessions in an official diplomatic context. That's going to be in the historical record forever." Lyrie laughed, the sound bright and unguarded. "Future scholars will analyze our agricultural discussions for deep political meaning. The Basel catastrophizing will be interpreted as metaphor. Everything becomes metaphor eventually. That's how we avoid taking responsibility for being ridiculous." Lyrie's expression turned more serious. "Thank you for being honest when I asked, and for backing me up in there when you probably shouldn't have. Honesty seems to be the thing I'm actually good at, even when it's inconvenient." Alina found herself smiling. "Besides, someone had to make sure you didn't start an interstellar incident while maintaining perfect diplomatic posture." "I have excellent posture even during mild treason." They stood together in the garden as the twin suns began their descent, casting everything in shades of amber and rose. The city beyond continued its ancient patterns, spiraling out from its drunken origins, full of people who were learning to see past their fears toward something more complicated and more honest. Somewhere, committees were forming and protocols being written, and the slow machinery of actual cooperation grinding into motion. But in the garden, with dirt under their fingernails and tomatoes ripening on the vine, Alina and Lyrie had already built something more important than treaties. They'd built a bridge out of honesty and tomatoes and terrible jokes about coffee. Sometimes that was enough.